because we do have a lunch scheduled for June, but that'll be in person. So I heard on the radio station I was listening to the other day, somebody made a comment that they'd heard that the president or the owner or founder of Zoom, he himself was tired of Zoom meetings. It saved us, obviously, and it's the only way we could exist, but I'm looking forward to be able to, hopefully the way things are going, maybe our first meeting as early as in the fall will be a live meeting. I mean, we'll continue to use Zoom. I mean, it's a big tool to be able to get speakers remotely that we wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So we'll continue to do that, and maybe even we'll do our live meetings over Zoom for people who can't or don't want to come to a live meeting. So, but hopefully we will have a core group anyway that can meet in person again. So after the presentation, we'll make a couple other issues addressed. One, the details on the lunch, and also the great response we have for speakers for next year. But we'll do that after the presentation by our speaker for today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gene as our program director to go ahead and introduce Paul Waugaman.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a marvelous write-up in our newsletter this month for Paul, but for our guests, just a quick highlight. Paul had an interesting career in federal government as well as teaching and in consulting. He got interested in history, but particularly the Civil War, as all of us have, and he's taught history. One of the happy outcomes of the pandemic, I guess, is that Ollie UA had to go to Zoom meetings this year, and Paul taught a course on the origins of the Civil War, which I signed up for, and just did a marvelous job. And so I'm excited to hear his presentation today on General Grant and the Vicksburg campaign, which, as we all know, was one of the key outcomes of the American Civil War. And so, Paul, thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. And I hope when all this Zoom stuff ends, you'll continue to grace us with your presence. So, Paul Waugaman, thank you.
Yeah, Zoom is just a way to suck me into this. I'll be here for as long as you let me, Gene. Let me say, teaching the Civil War in an organization like Ollie is sometimes, teaching anything is kind of a fearsome thing. But I had the feeling about the old story when I found out that Gene was in my class and Elise was in my class one time. I had the same feeling that the guy had who was killed during the Johnstown flood, and as a good man and a good person, he went to heaven. And St. Peter asked him, he said, "What would you like to do amongst the heavenly host?" And he said, "I would love to be able to tell the heavenly host about the horrors and terrors of unrestricted waterways and the flooding and the results of flooding." And so, and then Peter said, "Okay, we'll set up an initial lecture for you, and we'll invite the heavenly host here." And so the day that he was supposed to give his lecture, he walked out on the stage, and St. Peter leaned over to him. He said, "I just wanted to let you know Noah is in the audience." And I felt that way when Gene and Elise were in my class. But actually, I'm glad to have good, knowledgeable people join those classes, because they contribute greatly to the discussions, and to sometimes I was able to have some people do little presentations on specific issues, which also brought a lot to what really is a survey course. But anyway, enough of that. Let me start by sharing the screen, and I've kind of become dependent on PowerPoint, and so I'm going to use that to basically keep the lecture going and keep your attention. Whoops, share. Okay, I assume you all see that. Now let me go first to a couple of ground rules. So I like to use in my class. Most of you do this well. Elise has trained you, and you're pretty careful about some of these rules. But I'll just kind of, you can go through that while I bring up my video. And there we are. So really the biggest issue with doing Zoom is the background noise. And I have muted my cell phone and everybody around me. We have no dogs, but my lovely wife is sitting out of range of the picture. But she promises to be quiet. So we'll move on with that. So anyway, Elise mentioned the idea about using the question hand or Zoom and our chat and the chat function to get questions out. And we'll, depending on how things are going, I'll stop at some point and say, look, let's anybody have any questions at through this point. So with that in mind, this is what Elise does and does so well. And what I'll be doing, that's for you to figure out as we go along. So let's get started. What we want to talk about today, or what I want to talk about, is how Ulysses Grant really built a campaign to essentially close the Mississippi to the Confederate States and open it to the Union, and separate the Confederacy from its western extension, which was the source of a lot of food and a lot of agricultural goods that the South needed badly. And so what happened by 1863, the war in the West, and the West, by the way, I love Gary Gallagher's definition of the West. He takes out a map and he draws a little square around the northern part of Virginia between Washington and Richmond. He said, this is the East and everything else is the West. I didn't bring that map out, but in terms of the view and the focus of action, the West was a huge area that did not unfold the way the East did. There was essentially steady progress by the Union forces in the West, beginning with the fall of 1861, when the Grant as a mere brigadier general attacked the forts Henry and Donaldson, which controlled the river systems in Kentucky and Tennessee, and started to move down the Mississippi, and at the same time, Farragut's attack on New Orleans sort of closed the port and put a Union presence in place at the mouth of the Mississippi. So by January of 1863, the Union had control of the northern Mississippi River into the area around Memphis, Tennessee, and Holly Springs, Mississippi, and the southern river up to Baton Rouge. And Grant points out in his book the fact that the geography was really focused everything on Vicksburg, because between Memphis and Vicksburg, the eastern bank of the Mississippi side of the river was low, marshy, and was difficult, and was a difficult area to try to attack or move through. And from Vicksburg south, there was a series of bluffs along the eastern bank of the Mississippi, which was easily defended, but also carried high land that was important, was suitable for military operations. By January of 1863, Vicksburg was the remaining strong point. And although there wasn't the railroad bridge that exists there now, if you go to Vicksburg, there's a huge railroad bridge that crosses the Mississippi River there. But it was a cross-river transportation center. There was a railroad that came close to Vicksburg on the west side of the river, and then there was railroads going out of Vicksburg primarily to Jackson, and then branching out from there through the rest of the Confederacy. Other than the Mississippi Valley, the Union was in a strong position in the South, much more than it was in the East, or in the West, I should say, much more than it was in the East. Tennessee by that time was pretty well safe and converted. The Confederate advance into central Tennessee, which they did a couple of times, but the last one was blocked and there was a battle at Murfreesboro or Stone River, which really sort of cemented Union control of that area down to the Tennessee Valley. And more of that, I think, follows the Vicksburg campaign. So the real target was going to be Vicksburg, and it ties in. You've probably seen this map before. It's the sort of the overall grand strategy of the Union forces and the Union Army and Navy was to essentially squeeze the South through naval blockades, and then keeping resources away from the southern states through this Anaconda plan. What it fails to address, I think, is the importance of the Mississippi River, which is right here. In January, Grant was essentially in charge of all the forces outside in the Mississippi Valley. He did not have direct strategic control over Banks, who was at the southern end of the valley, but he didn't have control over Rosecrans and the army around Nashville and central Tennessee. That would change after Vicksburg. But he saw his principal objective as opening the Mississippi River, which meant he had to take Vicksburg and support the carrying of the Confederate forces at Fort Hudson, south of Vicksburg, or Port Hudson, south of Vicksburg. He had tried an overland attempt in November and December of '62, which sputtered out. So he moved far enough south to get to Oxford, Mississippi, which is about a third of the way between the Mississippi border and Vicksburg. He managed to suck out Pemberton's forces defending Vicksburg, and had some inconsequential results, didn't do very well in trying to force river crossings in central Mississippi, toward Oxford and south. Excuse me. He also had to deal with an interesting issue about who was controlling whom with the objective of capturing Vicksburg. General McClernand was a former United States representative and a Democrat from the state of Illinois, and he had some IOUs he held some IOUs from Lincoln because he supported Lincoln in 1860 and 1862 as a kind of a war Democrat. And so McClernand asked for or proposed that he raise forces and march down the Mississippi Valley and capture Vicksburg, just like that. So Lincoln allowed him to start raising new recruits in Indiana and Illinois for this venture, and it put General Halleck his nose out of joint too. And one of the times that Grant and Halleck worked together was trying to put McClernand under Grant's command, and that was working itself out in November, December, and January of 1863. It finally worked out because McClernand stayed in the North raising troops and organizing troops, but he was sending troops south to Memphis. And guess what? Grant said, they're moving into my department. They go into under Sherman's command. And so he kind of cherry picked the raising of forces by McClernand in the North. And the way it was dealt with was that McClernand complained. McClernand didn't get anywhere with his complaints. He became a corps commander in one of 3 corps commanders in Grant's Army of the Mississippi. There were some attempts starting in February. By that time, Grant had gotten out of Mississippi and gotten his troops, his main body of troops, into out of the inland of central Mississippi, began to essentially fight the guerrillas, the Southern guerrillas or irregulars east of Memphis, and moved the major body of his troops down toward Vicksburg along the Mississippi River. So the next phase of this came beginning in February, when he was really working on trying to find a way to get to Vicksburg through the swamps, through the bayous, and up the cliffs. And didn't do too well. And there's a whole sort of recitation in Grant's memoirs about these attempts, and we'll get to some of these in a minute. The command of the army at that time under Grant involved his really close buddy William Tecumseh Sherman, McClernand, and McPherson as the 3 corps commanders. Admiral Porter was the naval commander, and Grant was really a pioneer in this campaign at combined operations. And he and Porter got along well. They respected each other and they worked together well, and we'll see some of the results of that as we go. Now, on the other side, we have General Pemberton was in command of the armies in Western Mississippi. And it was his job basically to defend Vicksburg. And he saw the strategic value and was ready to do all he could to keep it from the Union. Joseph E. Johnston was one of those generals that in the Confederacy that I think Jefferson Davis tolerated but didn't respect or enjoy being around. But he needed someone with some leadership skills in the West. And Johnson had recuperated from injuries that he had suffered in the Peninsular Campaign around Richmond in the spring of 1862. And I think he was given a very difficult task, if not impossible, to stop the steady advances of the Union forces in the West. And so he was arriving on the scene as Grant was beginning to make his moves. And we'll talk about that a little bit. You'll see a little bit of that about that later. Pemberton is also an interesting character. He was born and raised in the North. I forget whether it was Pennsylvania or Ohio where he was, but he got his commission to West Point, or his nomination to West Point. But he married a Virginia lady, and as Virginia went, so went his wife, and so he went. So he was always a little suspect among his peers in the Confederate Army because he wasn't one of them. He was a Yankee. And if you've ever moved into the South from the North and you hear you're a Yankee, you know what that means. You know, you have to prove yourself. So Pemberton was still working on proving himself. So Grant had his final plan, worked on his final plan. And I'm going to stop after we talk about what that plan was before we get into the execution. And if you have any early questions, we can take it then. But he decided that he would have Pemberton and McPherson's corps march south along the western bank of the river, not the Mississippi, not right under the guns of Vicksburg, but several miles inland, which meant they had to build their road over the swamps and through the bayous. Sherman's corps would stay north of Vicksburg and create a diversion at the north side of Vicksburg at one of the bluffs that sort of followed the path of the Yazoo River, which comes into the Mississippi just north of Vicksburg. So he would stay and create a diversion. There would be a cavalry raid in force across from north to south through Mississippi, and that would try to disrupt supply lines to Vicksburg. And that cavalry raid, how many of you have ever seen The Horse Soldiers or read the book by the same name? I must be showing my age. The Horse Soldiers portrays this raid through Mississippi. It was pretty spectacular. The raid started near Corinth, and a brigade of troops marched through, rode all through Mississippi, down across the state, disrupted the railways at east of Jackson, and moved through Jackson and then went on south toward the U.S. forces at Port Hudson. So that was and that went off very well. While that was going on, Grant and his 2 corps were by that time were to get on the West Bank. Porter would move his flotilla down the river, past the guns of Vicksburg, and be in a position to ferry the army across the river, and also provide gunboat support from the river as they landed at a place called Grand Gulf. And then while that landing was taking place, Sherman would essentially bring his corps down the river and also cross at Grand Gulf. That was the plan. Before we get into the execution, this is a good time to stop and say, are there any questions or comments or thoughts? Hello, are you there? I see that Pemberton was born in Philadelphia, says Elise. Thank you. And he's buried there. He went full circle. Thank you, Paul and Elise.
Yeah, Paul, this group is just used to going for the full presentation, and then we'll ask questions and talk at the end.
If you can do it, I can do it. Okay. Here's a map, a contemporary map of Vicksburg at the time all this was going on. Now, you've got to understand that the arrow points north this way. So it's kind of our usual map. Well, I'm sorry, I moved the map. It's kind of our usual map on its side. This is the river, the Mississippi River coming down here. The Yazoo is coming in here. And there's a bend of literally a hairpin curve. And this is Vicksburg here. So the artillery at Vicksburg could essentially see their targets coming this way and begin to fire at them this way, and fire at them again as they headed south, as well as when they went around this curve. So it was a nasty spot. And a little later, I'm going to show you how the river has changed since then and how it is today. But this is what it was then. This was all marshy, lowland, some behind levees, and this could be occupied and held up to a certain point by Union troops. And it was in this area back here that roads were built. There was some attempts to dig canals in January and February that weren't successful. But there were roads built across this marshy area to go south of the river, or to go south of Vicksburg. This is a portrayal of Porter's fleet moving through the guns at Vicksburg, and here are the cliffs along the side of the river. What Porter tried to do was to keep his ships as close as they could to the east bank of the river, so that the Confederate guns could not be lowered far enough to low enough to really fire down on them. So that was his tactic. So in March, and so essentially this started in mid-March, and early in March and early in April, and I noticed here that my dates got screwed up. Think of everything that starts with March 15th as being April 15th. Okay, but through March and April, the McClernand went to work his troops went to work building the roads on the West Bank beyond the reach of the guns and even out of sight, so that they could march down to the down to the river. Sherman moved and in April, Sherman moved opposite to Vicksburg in the north. On an April 16th, not March 16th, Porter ran his gunboats and transport ships past Vicksburg at night. And and all but one of them would get through. By April 29th, troops were able to start crossing the river, not at Grand Gulf, but south of Grand Gulf at a place called Bruinsburg, that was an adjustment Grant had to make. And we're going to see more of Grant's adjustments as this campaign unfurls. The first engagements at Port Gibson and Grand Gulf were on May 1st. And by May 7th, Sherman had completed his relocation and crossed the river at Bruinsburg. So I want to go from here to a really nifty teaching tool that I used in my Ollie courses. They're called automated maps, and they were developed by the Civil War Heritage Foundation. They're available for download. They're not anything special or magical. I just use pieces of them to kind of describe the campaign and to kind of fill out what I said. So I'm going to start that right now.
In late 1862, Grant began his campaign for Vicksburg with a two-pronged strike, intending to lure Confederate forces from Vicksburg with the first prong, while the second, commanded by Major General William Sherman, struck at the city's lightly held defenses. But Confederate cavalry hit first, cutting Grant's long supply line, forcing him to fall back and allowing Confederates to shift men by rail to defeat Sherman's attacks at Chickasaw Bayou in late December. Grant spends the winter and early spring of 1863 trying a variety of routes to Vicksburg, each ending in failure. Yet amidst growing public cries to replace him, and against the advice of his closest advisors, Grant grew bolder, embarking upon the largest amphibious campaign in American history up to that time. In late March, Grant orders Major General John McClernand's 13th Corps to improve the route across Louisiana's swampy river bottoms. Out of the reach of Vicksburg's big guns, the Union force would then be ferried across the mighty river and onto Mississippi soil. Grant's plan is intricate, risky. Success hinges on Admiral David Porter's fleet of gunboats and troop transports, which on the night of April 16th make a daring race past the Vicksburg batteries, hugging the riverbank below to withstand their fire. Even with Porter's fleet south of Vicksburg, Grant continues to keep Pemberton guessing as to where he'll attack. On April 17th, the day after Porter's daring run, Grant launches a federal cavalry raid into the heart of Mississippi. On April 29th, Sherman feints an attack north of Vicksburg, while Union gunboats shell Grand Gulf, where Grant actually plans to ferry his army across the Great River. The cavalry raid ties up Pemberton's cavalry, leaving river crossings unguarded. Sherman's feint draws Confederate attention north of the city. Both keep Pemberton distracted from the true threat at Grand Gulf. The batteries there were too strong for Union gunboats, so Grant adapts and crosses instead at Bruinsburg. By April 30th, Grant realizes a goal he had toiled 6 months to achieve. The lead element of his army is on the Confederate side of the river. For the next 17 days, His army would march more than 200 miles and fight 5 battles in a campaign never before witnessed on American soil.
So, for the rest of the story, we had, by May 8th, as it said, all of the 3 corps were across the river. The 2 skirmishes or battles at Grand Gulf and Port Gibson really sort of opened Grant's options. And what he did, rather than go directly north toward Vicksburg, is he started northeast across Mississippi. And I think his idea was maybe not to go as far as Jackson, but by that time, Johnson and even Pemberton were getting troops toward Jackson and figured out that's where Grant was going. So he rather than turn north after he confronted troops at Raymond, Mississippi, Grant changed his plans and sent 2 corps to Jackson. That was McClernand and Sherman went toward Jackson, while I'm sorry, McPherson. I'm getting my Scottish names mixed up. McPherson and Jackson and Sherman went to Jackson. McClernand started north toward the railroad that ran east-west between Jackson and Vicksburg. So the idea there was he would keep McClernand would keep Pemberton at bay. Well, they took care of what was going to be behind them at Jackson. So they moved from Raymond up to Jackson, took supply and got rid of the railroad, got rid of supplies, and essentially chased Joseph Johnson and whatever troops he had out of Jackson to the north and the east. They used their matches well and destroyed factories and supply dumps. And of course, that set fires going on through the entire city of Jackson. And the Union forces under Grant began to develop the reputation for burning everything they came across. So anyway, the combined Union forces then started moving west, and that led to battles at Champions Hill, which is about 1/3 of the way toward Vicksburg from Jackson, and then on to another one at the Big Black after Pemberton lost lost his position at Champions Hill, and then within a day, Grant was at the gates of Vicksburg, and had essentially cut Vicksburg off and seriously reduced Pemberton's forces. So we'll go into the next phase on the animated map.
Moving inland, up steep bluffs, marched the soldiers of McClernand's corps. In the early morning hours of May 1st, they hit a Confederate brigade. For the next 17 hours, up to 8,000 Confederates put up a noble defense in the rugged terrain surrounding Port Gibson, holding back 20,000 Federals. By late afternoon, outflanked and low on ammunition, the Confederates fall back. The loss here causes the Confederate evacuation of Grand Gulf on May 2nd. With his beachhead secure, Grant's plan truly unfolds. Now, aware of Grant's true intentions, Pemberton assumes he will march north for Vicksburg. But Grant has already rejected that approach as too restrictive. Instead, using the Big Black River as a shield, he plans to cut the rail line which feeds Vicksburg with supplies and reinforcements. Then he will turn and trap Pemberton at Vicksburg. It was this type of bold, indirect strategy that would become the hallmark of Grant's military career. By May 12th, joined by Sherman's Corps, Grant marches along a 10-mile front aiming to attack the Southern Railroad the next morning. Pemberton shifts his army and rushes a Confederate brigade by rail to Jackson with orders to strike Grant's right flank. These 3,000 Confederates slam into Major General James McPherson's 10,000 men along the banks of 14 Mile Creek, just southwest of Raymond. Unaware that they are outnumbered 3-1, Confederates launch a fierce attack. After almost 6 hours, McPherson's artillery and numeric advantage has the rebels retreating to Jackson. Realizing he can't safely march on Vicksburg with a large body of Confederates now at his rear, Grant wields 2/3 of his army toward the state capital. He cuts rail and telegraph lines along the way and hinders communication between Pemberton and the one man sent to assist him. On the night of May 13th, General Joe Johnston, the hero of 1st Manassas, arrives at Jackson to take charge of the grim Confederate predicament in Mississippi. Within hours, even as his reinforcements near Jackson, Johnston wires the authorities in Richmond that he is too late and orders the city evacuated. The next morning, Sherman and McPherson's divisions push back Confederate artillery and roadblocks from a handful of Confederate regiments. By late afternoon on May 14th, the United States flag flies once again over the state capitol. Grant spares none of his men to occupy Jackson and put its military supplies and rail lines to the torch. Then he turns his army toward Vicksburg. As Jackson burned, Pemberton had moved with 20,000 men to attack Grant's supply line. Without a working telegraph, Confederate communications unraveled. As Johnston gathers reinforcements to the northeast, Pemberton moves southeast. On May 16th, Pemberton receives a 2-day-old message from Johnston, ordering him to Clinton. As Pemberton reverses his column, Grant closes in. Pemberton hastily deploys his divisions along a 3-mile front to face 2 advancing Federal columns, but he is unaware of a third moving toward his exposed left flank. Brigadier General Stephen Lee of Stevenson's division shifts his brigade to a hill owned by Sid Champion. Brigadier General Alfred Cummings' Georgians moved to fill a gap and block the Union division's closing on the Middle Road. And at 10:30 that morning, at Champion Hill, Grant starts the battle, destined to seal Vicksburg's eventual fate. If Pemberton's thin left flank crumbles, Grant will control the Baker's Creek Bridge and Pemberton's escape route to Vicksburg. Seth Barton's Georgia Brigade hustles to stop the Union onslaught. By 11:30 a.m., the fighting on Champion Hill turns viciously hand-to-hand, with Stevenson's division eventually thrown back to the Jackson Road. Major General John Bowen's division savagely drives the Federals back to the Champion House. But a second Federal assault overwhelms them. Reinforcements led by Major General William Loring arrive too late, and Bowen's men fall back. Their retreat turns to panic as Grant's divisions converge. Their main escape route now cut off, Pemberton's men had managed to construct a second bridge, which they used to retreat to Edwards, though not before Grant's army is able to strand Loring on the east side of Baker's Creek. Out of communication with Pemberton and believing Grant has already taken Edwards, Loring orders his vital 8,000-man division to Jackson and away from the defenses at Vicksburg. Unaware of Loring's decision, Pemberton waits for him that night in the fortification at the Big Black River Bridge. Instead, he is met the next morning by McClernand's corps, which immediately attack and send the rebels running to the safety of Vicksburg. The battles at Champion Hill and Big Black River cost Pemberton dearly: 25% of his army, 45 cannon, and the faith of his men. 30 years ago to the day, Pemberton had accepted a cadetship to West Point. As he rode back to Vicksburg, he notes, and today that career is ended in disaster and disgrace. Grant's trap is now set.
All right. Kind of to get through the mobile part of this campaign. This map summarizes it, I think, pretty well. The movement down the river from staging areas here over roads cut by Union troops, crossing. The first crossing point was here at Grand Gulf. Here comes the river down here, past Vicksburg, and then down along the bluffs, and then back out in the flats again. The bluffs run kind of along here. And that's where Grant was trying to go. Anyway, major engagements here and here open the road. And instead of going this way, Grant goes this way into Mississippi, on dry land, by the way. McClernand starts off this way and then is called back when they realized there was an engagement coming here at Raymond. After the Confederate troops here are subdued, the two corps go this way, and McClernand's corps goes this way toward Champions Hill. After they turn from Jackson and head this way along the railroad. And by the way, if you're traveling this way contemporaneously, this is I-20 along here through Mississippi. Here's Champions Hill, as I said, about a third of the way, 2/3 of the way from Vicksburg. The retreat goes back here across the Big Black and ends up with the Union Army beginning to lay siege to this perimeter around Vicksburg along the top of the bluffs. So that's where we are there. This really is the really interesting part of the campaign in terms of Grant's ability to move, to anticipate, to bring his power to bear where he wants it on his terms, and still not lose sight of the main objective, which is control Vicksburg. So this is what I mean when I say this was really, this is why the campaign is still taught at West Point. So talk a little about the siege. Grant attempts to breach the lines twice after he settles in May 18th. One of them is what they call Redan 18, the next day. Let's do it quick, let's get it over with. It didn't work. Sherman suffered some heavy casualties trying to do that. A general attack is tried May 2nd or May 22nd, a few days later. This time, McClernand gets very excited about what he thought were great advantages he was taking. You're going to hear this interpreted differently in the next part of the moving maps, but I'm just going by what Grant says in his memoirs, that essentially McClernand called for reinforcements when he didn't have the controlling position he thought he had. So that's not the entire reason they didn't get through, but it was a major reason. Okay, Grant goes into siege mode, and guess what they try during the siege? They try a mine, sort of a preview to Petersburg. They mine under one of the Confederate strong points, explode the mine, the ground caves in, the Union troops move in, but they can't carry the breach. There is an attempt by Southern Confederate troops from the west to come up past Milliken's Bend. That's defeated largely through the fact that the Confederate forces weren't strong enough, and there was enough Union resistance, including a colored regiment, an African-American regiment, that essentially blocked that. Johnson never got enough forces in place to try to relieve it by attacking Grant's rear, although there were some skirmishes with Sherman's corps on the northern side of the siege line. But Johnson ultimately retired from trying to do anything there. In the meantime, the Brownwater Navy continued to bring Grant reinforcements, so that he was moving reinforcements into the siege area and getting stronger as Pemberton and everybody was growing weaker. This means that things were really running down. And let me tell you, if you've ever been in Vicksburg, Mississippi in June, you can understand how fast people can get fatigued by the heat and the humidity. This picture is contemporary, and this is probably the Sherman's part of the line, and it shows essentially shelling going on. This is the river coming from north around the bend and then off to the south. The city of Vicksburg is behind this bluff. Moving right along, let's see how the Civil War organization, Civil War History Society finishes the.
On May 17th, Pemberton's demoralized soldiers, reeling from the loss at Big Black River, began streaming into the city. They worked through the night to shore up their fortifications. Vicksburg's land defenses stretched more than 8 miles, with 9 major forts connected by rifle pits, artillery embrasures, and parapets of earthen logs. One such stockade redan guarded the graveyard road leading into Vicksburg. Wanting to avoid a lengthy siege, Grant attacked here on May 19th. After a 5-hour artillery barrage, Sherman goes in, but piles of brush and sharpened tree limbs unravel formations as Confederate crossfire cuts men down in scores. Pinned down, Confederates lob hand grenades into their midst. The Federals used the cover of darkness to fall back to their lines. Almost 1,000 of Grant's men are killed, wounded, or missing. Behind his stout defenses, Pemberton loses only 70. On May 22nd, Grant tries again on a much wider 3-mile front. Only McClernand's corps gains a foothold. He sends Grant a message to keep up the pressure. But they are beaten back and lose another 3,000 men. Grant realizes he has no other choice but to lay siege, ordering his commanders to dig their lines closer to the Confederate trenches. By mid-June, they began mining beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and on June 25th, the Federals explode 2,200 pounds of black powder. Soldiers from both sides pour into the crater, fighting for more than 20 hours before Grant calls off the attacks. By July 6th, the Federals will be prepared to detonate 13 more mines, but it will not be necessary. For 47 days, soldiers and Vicksburg citizens endure a constant nightmare. Day and night, up to 200.
Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can start that again. I got too ambitious.
Flourishes, medical supplies dwindle. Every public building and many homes are now hospitals. Wagons make daily rounds to pick up the dead. Rebel soldiers' rations are by now a handful of peas and rice and a single cup of water per day. Sickness and desertion leave fewer men on the front lines. One day in late June, a notice slid under the door of Pemberton's headquarters. It reads, "If you can't feed us, surrender us." Signed, many soldiers. Following a dire report from his subordinates that his army lacks the strength to make a breakout attack, on July 2nd, Pemberton realizes he has no choice. He must surrender. On July 3rd, 1863, there came a sound, ominous for some, for weeks unheard by all. Silence. That day, Grant and Pemberton meet to discuss terms of surrender. With the anniversary of American independence only a day away, Pemberton hopes Grant will be in a generous mood. Instead, Grant demands unconditional surrender. Pemberton refuses. Later that evening, Grant offers terms. Instead of taking Pemberton's army prisoner, he will parole them. Many will go home at once. Pemberton accepts, and on the 4th of July, the Confederates stack arms, handing over the city of Vicksburg to the Union forces. The South's Gibraltar had fallen. With the capture of Port Hudson, 5 days later, the Mississippi River is entirely in Union hands. Grant loses 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, and inflicts nearly as many losses on the Confederates. But aided by Porter's fleet, he disperses an entire rebel army and cuts the South supply line. Soon, even the most basic goods like salt to preserve meat would grow increasingly scarce. Yet the Vicksburg campaign is overshadowed in the press by the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg the day before. And only in the coming decades would Grant's accomplishment be recognized. Late into the 20th century, coalition forces in the First Gulf War were still using tactics inspired by Grant's Vicksburg campaign.
Okay, I'm going to stop right now and make sure we have a little bit of time for any discussion or comments or anything. John put a great question in the chat. And John, would you like to unmute yourself and repeat it verbally and see if we can start some discussion?
The first comment I put two on there. I assume the first one is about many say that Grant's campaign here was masterful and that he basically cut his supply line and went internally into Mississippi to Jackson and then back to without a real supply support, sort of living off the land, a precursor to Sherman's march to the sea. I would say that wasn't the case. He was in fact supported, at least with ammunition and probably with food, by, as you say, the Navy bringing stuff down along the river. And it was a long chain, but not a broken chain. So I just wondered whether you had any view on what you thought the case was.
Well, I think you're right about he had to get munitions somehow. But those were not the major sort of tonnage that had to follow in a conventional supply system. And the real tonnage in bulk was in forage for the animals and food for the troops. And what Grant had found out during his withdrawal from central Mississippi in December of 1862 was that there was a lot more goods and food available in that part of the country than they thought was going to be available. And he literally withdrew to Holly Springs and on back to Memphis with more than I think he started with. Okay, so he was aware that his army an army on an offensive operation could live off the land too. So that was a lesson learned from that first attack, and he put it to use in the second phase of the campaign.
Good, thanks.
Any other? Let's see. You didn't, and you asked, and Bob Irwin asked a question. Is it true that Vicksburg or entire state of Mississippi did not celebrate the 4th of July for 70 years or so after? I would not be surprised. I am not that much of an expert in history to figure it out, but it would most certainly be part of the lost cause approach to history, governance, and policy that sort of clutched the South from the end of Reconstruction to almost right up to the 1950s.
As I understand it, it was not until World War II.
Okay. That would not surprise me.
Apparently, it was after World War II because of a visit of General Dwight Eisenhower, and that's when they began celebrating July 4th again.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. I did some work at the University of Mississippi and professionally in the late 90s and early 2000s, and there is still, or was at that time still a lot of really deep feeling about the Civil War and the outcome of the Civil War in that part of the country. But to the credit of the state of Mississippi and the university, they were fully integrated by then, thanks to the work of, thanks to things like the James Meredith affair. But they were they were doing very well, thank you.
Another question we have, Paul, is did McClernand perform any significant role in the Civil War after Vicksburg?
I would be very surprised. I don't know I don't know for a fact. But I would be very surprised if he did, because he and Grant did not get along. And you had to get along with Grant to succeed anywhere, not just in the West, but anywhere after in 1864 and beyond.
Again, as I understand it, due to McClellan's political, it took a while, but I think Grant eventually managed to get rid of him. He wanted to get rid of him a lot earlier, but he had to politically be a little delicate. But as my understanding, people could look it up, Grant eventually got rid of him and sent him out of his army. Where
Yes.
he went from there, I don't know. But Grant wanted to get rid of him as soon as he could.
Oh, yeah. And it was after that attack, the second attack that he was able to work to engineer that. So McClellan was gone before the siege would, and just as the siege was settling down.
Yeah, this is John. I think he was successfully fired by Grant. He wrote a press release that was published in the papers, and he took credit for that attack. And that was the straw that broke the back for General Grant. But I think he did, once Grant went to the east, I think McClellan remained in the west, and I think he was under, he was at the Battle of Nashville and some of those places out there in the west.
Okay, that would have been in 64.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not under Grant. He was under Thomas at the time.
Thomas and Rosecrans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another
Okay.
question is, reportedly after crossing at Bruinsburg, Grant received orders to wait for General Banks to arrive from Port Hudson to take command. Grant reportedly ignored the order to wait or never acknowledged receipt of the order. Any opinion on why?
I have heard that same story, and I don't know where those orders came from. If they came from Washington, from Halleck or the War Department, they weren't aware of the situation on the ground, and I think Grant just knew what he wanted to do, and he just up and did it. I'll have to go back and look. That's a good question. It's a good question, and I want to go back and look at his memoirs. If anyone has them handy and would like to look that up, and see if he says anything about that.
Another question is, why didn't the Confederates reinforce Vicksburg? And how much did Robert E. Lee have to do with not sending more troops to Vicksburg?
Well, let's leave Lee out of it for just a minute, because, but I think the question is, when would they have reinforced Vicksburg, and how much resources did they have? They probably, I would guess that Johnson was having a real hard time when he showed up in May in getting enough men to do anything with. And the Trans-Mississippi didn't have a lot of people, a lot of surplus troops to throw at it themselves. They tried at Milliken's Bend, but they just didn't have the right enough people. And Johnson tried one time during the siege and realized that Grant was beating him at the supply and logistics game, was getting more people while he couldn't raise any more people. So I think, although Johnson takes a certain amount of grief from lost cause historians and writers for not relieving Vicksburg, but Johnson was a guy who knew what his limitations were.
Okay, your son mentions that in Wikipedia, it says McClernand spent some time in the Gulf in 1864 and then resigned in November that year. He also
Okay.
did some work in Red River Red River campaign, but was ill for most of the time.
Okay.
That's according to your son and Wikipedia.
Thank you,
Okay,
Dawn.
right, one more question we have here. According to the late Ed Bars, the Big Black River route was never discussed in post-war gatherings of Confederate veterans of the battle. Any thoughts?
Okay. I'm assuming that the Big Black River route would have been it's kind of a situation what might have been. And that was if Grant moved up along the Big Black instead of going inland. Let me put up the map again. So get a look at that. That Big Black campaign, Big Black route would have been through this area here, maybe along the bluffs. And here's the Big Black River coming along here. Okay, so I don't know. I don't know why he would have. I don't think he had ever planned to do that in any event, but it might have been the end of his army trying to move through that country. So I don't know what the Confederates thought. They'd have loved it, I think, if he'd have gone up tried to go up between the Big Black and the Mississippi River.
I think if you look at the question, I think he meant route, not a route like being overwhelmed, not a route to take.
Oh, okay. Okay.
At least that's how I interpreted it.
I'm sorry. They don't. No, I wouldn't talk about it either. If I were Confederate, an ex-Confederate, they didn't do so well there, and I think the map shows some of the reasons why. The automated map shows some of the reasons why. A small but significant hunk of his army gets separated, and the rest of the army gets back across, but is not able to hold a position against the Union troops.
Well, Paul, this has been an absolutely fantastic presentation. Do you have any closing remarks before we turn it back over to our president, John?
John, if you don't mind, I'll put up my last slide, or put up two last slides here, which I didn't want to finish. This is what Vicksburg looks like now. All right, this is taken from the Park Service map of the Vicksburg Military Park here. Here's the city of Vicksburg now, and here is the old river course, and here is the river course now. There have been some major changes there in that geography, but you can see that this park follows the military the lines, and I have been able to make one stop at Vicksburg. I'd love to go back. I know Elise has been there. If you're going east anytime, it's worth a stop. It's right off the interstate out at the edge of Vicksburg, the National Military Park, and it's like Gettysburg, but much less intimidating and overwhelming in terms of size. You really can see what both sides were confronted with in geography.
And they also have an amazing exhibit on the Cairo, the one gunboat that was sunk, and which Ed Bars, of course, was responsible for raising. And you can walk onto it now, and they have a fabulous exhibit. It is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's right.
Elise?
I didn't. Yeah, Steve.
I was going to say, if I could add to this, yeah, if you only have time, definitely Vicksburg, but Don't ignore Raymond and Champions Hill. I was there probably 20 years ago, and Raymond had like the little roadside, but apparently there's a Raymond Battlefield Locals. Now there's a Raymond Battlefield Park about a mile southwest. They've got the battle lines, they've got signage. They've done a wonderful job. So to better, like you pointed out, Paul, to understand the Vicksburg campaign, most people don't realize there was the series of battles before.
Yeah,
Definitely hit Raymond. And then Champion Hill, I'm understanding, maybe somebody help me. I've heard there's moves. They put up a lot more signage. And I think there's a move to either make it a state battlefield park or possibly even a national battlefield. I know the
I
Civil
think
War.
the Battlefield Trust bought some of it just recently, I think, and they
Right.
plan to improve.
I was going to say the trust has bought a lot. They put up the signage, and I think there's moves to either a state or a national battlefield. So if you have the time, definitely hit Raymond, definitely hit Champion Hill. And even they got a sign, stop for 5 minutes at the signs at the Big Black River. But there's more to Vicksburg than people realize. And if you got the time, hit the side battles too.
absolutely. Thank you very much. It makes that next trip across I-20 a little bit more interesting. Keep that. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Paul.
nice to
Great
know.
job.
Thank you all.
And, appreciate it. And I noticed your son came on the line. I think it's appropriate that I think he gave us our first presentation at the beginning of the year. And now the other Waugaman finishes up as presenting for this year. So
Well,
both of you did great jobs, and we appreciate your interest and support.
well, maybe we'll put our heads together and see what we can do for next year.
Okay. I just throw in, as a sailor at one point in my career, there's a story about Vicksburg that always entertained me, that Sherman and the early advances and approaches in 63, one of them was to come across the bayou up north, which the Confederates had flooded to a large extent. They'd broken the dikes, along the river in a lot of places, and they flooded it to make it inaccessible, but they sent the gunboats in there anyway. And they described now that the water had come up, the places that used to be passable waterways were now overhung with tree branches, and they paint the picture of the gunboats going through these places where the tree branches, they had to put people on the bow with saws to cut the trees off as they tried to make their way through the river. So
Yeah,
it was one of the ones that didn't succeed, but I thought it was a novel way of use of gunboats. So
that's true.